Hey Wargamers, you've been asking for it, and today it's finally here, my winners and losers list for Tyranids in 9th edition. Now, that is to say, this is a video about which units I think have benefited the most from the core changes to 9th edition, and which have suffered the most from those same rule changes. Now, how this actually plays out in terms of army composition is going to depend a lot on points. Yes, we have some idea of what those points changes are, but this is looking purely at the rules aspect of it and not necessarily considering those point changes. If something goes up by a lot or goes down by a lot, that can compensate for some of these changes. So keep that in mind. So starting off our list of winners is the Hivecrown. Now, really all Tyranid monsters have big advantages in 9th edition. They can hide behind obscuring terrain. They are no longer, shut out of combat inside ruins. There's a lot to be happy about if you are a fan of monsters in the Tyranid Codex. And so this applies to, Carnifexes, Tyrannifexes, Hive Tyrants, you name it. I think monsters have a big leg up in 9th edition, and that's a pretty common opinion, right? But one of the monsters that I'm most excited about is actually the Hivecrown. It's not aircraft, meaning that it can still be hidden by obscuring terrain. Note that the obscuring effect points out Titanic units and things that are aircraft. Well, flying monsters creatures aren't aircraft, so they still benefit from a lot of those same core monster abilities, just they can fly, right? They're flying monsters creatures. So yeah, it makes sense. But in particular, the Hivecrown has something going for it in the form of having both melee and shooting attacks. The Drool Cannon is an auto hit. It's a really nasty weapon. That means you can use it when you're non-combat, but also when you are in combat, and that -1 modifier doesn't impact it. So it's still an auto hit in close combat, which is pretty important. Tentaclid missiles as well. Those things will work in close combat, so you can shoot those things off there too. You have a lot of options with the Hivecrown, both in shooting and in melee, and I think that makes it a really appealing choice. It's more survivable and more deadly in 9th edition than it was before. Now, I don't know if 9th edition is the edition of the Tyranid warrior for Tyranid players, but it sure as heck isn't the edition of the Termagant or the Hormagant, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So, Tyranid warriors have a lot going for them just because they're not those other guys, but they also have things that make them valuable in their own right. One is that they are synapse troops. So they're going to be good objective grabbers because they're troops, but they also have synapse, which means that they're not reliant on having other characters nearby, and they are going to ignore a lot of the new morale issues that pop up with 9th edition. You're not going to have to take your morale tests or lose models as readily as you might if you were outside of synapse range, because they're always in synapse range because they're their own synapse. So that's really good. They also have smaller squad sizes, 3, 6 guys, maybe even 9 if you're wanting to push it. But 3 to 6 guys is going to be a pretty happy number of warriors for you. And this avoids all the issues that you run into with unit coherency and with blast weapons. So having these smaller, self-contained, highly self-reliant units in the form of Tyranid warriors offers a lot in terms of leveraging the 9th edition rules to your advantage. And then finally, they're just adaptable. They're infantry, which means that they can key off of a lot of the terrain rules, and they also have a very diverse weapon set. So they can take all sorts of different war gear that's going to make them highly adaptable and highly versatile in your army construction. So I think Tyranid warriors have a lot going for them within 9th edition. Finally, to round off my list of top 3 winners, we have Hive Guard. Now, these guys are just generally good, but with all the changes to how line of sight works and how terrain works in 9th edition, having something that ignores line of sight is more important than ever. And so having a really solid weapon in the form of the Impaler Cannon, 36-inch range, having that ignore line of sight just seems like it's going to be better than ever. That combined with having the increased prevalence of vehicles and monsters, most likely based on how things are going, having a weapon that can handle those monsters, handle those vehicles, is needed. So we can gain a lot from having these small, reliable shooter units that can see anything on the board. 36 inches is huge considering the smaller board size. So put these guys, somewhere near the middle of the board, they're going to be able to shoot everything basically, and that is very valuable. Now on to the guys that haven't fared so well. Starting this list is going to be the lowly Termagant. Termagants and also Hormagaunts really rely on having those larger units, at least 10, if not 20 or 30 strong. And there's a lot in 9th edition that says don't do that. First and foremost, blast weapons are going to max out on these guys, and they're easy to kill anyway. You don't necessarily need to make it easier to kill them with blast weapons, but blast weapons certainly will take them down much quicker now than they would have in 8th edition. They're dependent on synapse to avoid morale, which means that they can't really venture too far away. That means that they have to stay close to those synapse creatures, and the changes to unit coherency and how coherency can really trip you up if you don't plan your movement or take your casualties away in the correct order, means that conga lines or having really aggressive movements with Termagants can be a very risky maneuver. So that really dissuades you from taking a large unit, and then once you get down to a unit of 10, they're just not as effective, and they still are going to be subject to blast weapons and morale and stuff like that, assuming they're not within synapse range. So it's hard to maneuver them. It's hard to keep them on the table. There's really not a lot going for the Termagant in 9th edition. I really don't see it. One thing that they could have is just being a cheap outflank unit. You can kind of think about them, packing them with some devourers and having them outflank. They're really cheap. You're able to do that without spending a lot of CP, and you could get the surprise on someone. But that's going to be kind of a one and done thing. As soon as they're on the tabletop from that outflank maneuver, they're going to be off the tabletop. So they're really a suicide unit at that point, and I don't know if that's worth it. Everything I said about Termagants really applies to Hormagaunts as well. I went back and forth about whether or not to just include this as one entry, but I think there's some additional debilitating changes for Hormagaunts in 9th edition that make them their own entry here as well. So, of course, large units are a liability. Changes to blast mean that they're going to die quicker. Changes coherency means that they have to stay as one blob, and that makes it harder for them to stay within synapse, gain buffs, and also to reach their targets when charging. You have to stay in coherency when performing a charge, and so they're not going to be able to leverage large numbers either in terms of morale or in terms of just staying or getting into combat. They're not going to be able to stretch out across the board in the same way that they used to. They have to stay as one blob. And so these changes to coherency are not only impactful to their movement, but also to their ability to do the only thing that they can do, which is charge. So that's pretty big. And then also having to be within half inch of a unit that is within half inch of the enemy in order to actually attack in melee means that you're not going to be able to leverage their numbers at all. You're going to get a few Hormagaunts in any given combat, and that's just not worth it. You're not really, the strength in the Hormagaunt lies in its numbers and its cheapness, and you can't outweigh that, or you can't really leverage that if you're only allowing a couple Hormagaunts to fight in a turn. So these things combined make Hormagaunts even worse off than Termagants in 9th edition. Similarly, you could see having a group of them in reserve. Let's say you have an Exocrine or a Tyrannifex on your back line and you're worried about getting assaulted. You can have these guys in reserve so that they can just pop off a counter assault if those focal units do get assaulted. You could go that route. But again, is it really worth it? I'm not sure. I don't see it right now. I think if you're going to do that, you might as well go with something that's going to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more reliable. Maybe Gene Stealers are going to be a better option there, again, or Tyranid Warriors. Either of those, I think, are going to be a more reliable counter assault unit than Hormagaunts. And then finally, one of the more surprising units to be affected by 9th edition here is going to be the Venom Thrope. Now, Venom Thropes are, they're situationally beneficial. They offer a lot to an army if they can stay on the tabletop, which has historically been one of the challenges when comparing it to something like the Malanthrope. The Venomthrope is better off in 9th edition compared to the Malanthrope due to changes in the character keyword, but it still is going to be very challenging to utilize the Venomthrope for a few reasons. One is that the emphasis in 9th edition seems to be on mobility, not on castling. And so if you are trying to get across the board, get to different objectives, it's going to be challenging to stay next to your Venomthrope unit. Similarly, it's going to be really hard to occupy multiple spaces on the board, have that board control, and still stay within range of a Venomthrope unit. You could certainly do that with 1 or 2 units, but if you're trying to have a whole mass of units be affected by a single Venomthrope unit, that's going to be harder to do because you're not going to be able to conga line them back. You're not going to be able to have the types of unit formations that would really enable that type of benefit. And so the benefit of the Venomthrope unit itself is decreased because you're not able to apply it to as many units. And then finally, one of the strengths of the Venomthrope unit is that you can build the unit larger to have its area of effect be larger. And that's really discouraged from 9th edition. 9th edition is really focused on MSU, multiple small units, and building a Venomthrope unit up to 6 models is really a liability. It means it's more vulnerable to shooting and to like unit coherency, things like that too. So really a 6 model unit, not that impressive. And then once you go down to 5 models, you lose the benefit anyway. So, really you're looking at a 3-man unit of Venomthropes, and then, it's just not as good. You have all these issues that we've been talking about amplified even more with the smaller area of effect bubble. So overall, I think the Venomthrope is just a lot harder to use and inherently less beneficial in 9th edition than it was in 8th. And so it's on my list of losers because it's just not good, not as good anymore. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Are there things that you want to see in the winners or in the losers list that I didn't talk about? Love to hear about it. I know I didn't talk about Rippers. Rippers, I think, get a honorable mention as being a really valuable unit in 9th edition. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching and happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. This channel is made possible by my supporters over on Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, consider joining our community over there. Special thanks to Shifty, Michael Byrne, Jim Bob, Tao Oswell, Drew Prattley, Stephen Cohen, Jake Johnson, Alex Hanna, Ruger, Jacob Harkreiter, Mark Schwering, Zealous Brimstone, Jared Egler, and Chris Kessler.